I logged onto the Cube Talk Discord and saw Arlo, and she was like, eh. And I'm like, whatever. Then Ollie Beeks comes up to me, and they're all like, Echoing Boon is too good. And I'm like, yeah, whatever. So later, I'm in the YouTube comments, and this guy's like, well, actually, and I'm like, yeah, whatever. Cause this is my cube, and I will do whatever. And this is my cube, and I will do whatever. And this is my cube, and I will do whatever. Then it's 3 a.m. I'm doing test drafts. Trainmaster GT comes up and he's like, new cards are cool. And I'm like, yeah, whatever. Then I'm writing in my change log. Beep Man comes up and he's all like, hey, why aren't you playing? And I'm like, yeah, whatever. And then up comes Parker and I'm like, yo, Parker, what's up? He's like, nothing. I'm like, that's cool. Cause this is my cube and I will do whatever. And this is my cube and I will do whatever.
Hi everybody, it's me, Andy, the host of Lucky Paper Radio, and I'm here with my co-host, Anthony, real-life Thallid Maddox.
I don't know what to do with that.
I basically stole this one from James. I thought it was great. You were making all these mold things, you were growing koji, and James said one step closer to being a real Saprling, which I feel like you're more like a real-life Thallid, because you're not the mold, you're making the mold.
Sure. I'm just picturing myself as what's the TV show everybody loves with the mushroom zombies?
There used to be a video game. It's like yeah, Last of Us.
I think that's it.
Yeah, molds.
I'm not like that, and I'm not growing molds like that. I'm growing nice molds, good molds.
I thought you liked saplings. I thought saplings were good molds.
I do love saplings.
Okay, here's a dumb guy question.
Okay,
are you ready for me to be a dumb guy?
Sure. Yeah. You got to be one of today's lucky 10,000 learning a new thing.
Are Thallids based on a real life thing?
No, not really. So
does that word mean anything in English?
The word thallus means something, and that's a little bit what tripped me up. Yet, be careful, thallus with a TH.
Mm-hmm.
It's
don't get phallic.
It's a kind of a word for a nebulous type of organ that some plants have. It's basically like an organ that has no distinct tissues. So a lot of things like liverworts, those little plants that have like no distinct tissues, and I think some mosses and some fungi, when a bunch of like hyphae or mycelia come together into some kind of larger body, that's called a thallus. So I'm assuming that's where the magic creatures were inspired by that word, I'm sure.
When you say they have no distinct tissues, you mean like they're all one thing?
Yeah, like there's no...
They're homogenous, there's no stem and leaves.
Look at your arm, you got veins, and you got
aware that I have
layers
different
of skins
tissues.
And all kinds of stuff. It's just like, one kind of cellular mass.
But they look nothing like Thallids in Magic, early days.
No, I mean, it's just like a little mushroom or a little funny little blobby plant.
Okay.
Imagine little blobby organisms. I love saprolings, though. That is true. And I was wondering if we could do a whole episode and just talk about why I love saprolings.
We're going to find out, because that's the plan for this episode, so we'll see how long we get talking about your love of saprolings.
If it sucks, we just scrap it. Just do another episode. It'll be fine.
No, we just released a 25-minute thing called Anthony's Love Letter to Saprolings.
Perfect.
It'll be fine.
We've done a couple episodes recently talking about aesthetics, and I think a couple things that came up that were really interesting to me was this idea from Frank Lance's book, The Beauty of Games, about how games have an aesthetic quality that goes beyond just literally the picture on the box, but like the actual game itself, like the choices that you're making has an aesthetic quality. And then we talked on the most recent book club episode a lot about how not only do games sort of have an aesthetic quality, there's also a lot of like values that are baked into games and the kinds of decision trees that you're crossing with games and the way that you're interacting with people through games. And I thought it would be interesting just to talk a little bit about our specific sort of aesthetic preferences and tastes and how that relates to games, and how our aesthetic preferences within Magic also relate to our preferences outside of that. So I'm a little bit curious. I have a bunch of thoughts on my own, but like, do you see that you have an aesthetic sensibility that you could sort of describe in kind of an elevator pitch, and then do you see that translating to the kinds of things that you like in Magic?
So you're asking if I have an aesthetic sensibility that's like overarching across my life.
Yeah,
not
exactly.
necessarily specifically in magic. That's a big question. I definitely think I have aesthetic sensibilities.
It's maybe one of those things that, classic. We say this all the time. To ask a fish what's water, they can't tell you. It's like you've only existed within your own aesthetic sensibilities, so it's hard to maybe have a perspective on what that is.
Well, I think having studied graphic design and gone to art school maybe puts you in a unique position to actually have at some point interrogated your own aesthetic sensibility to some degree.
That's fair, yeah.
And I think the first aesthetic sensibility I can think of is that I generally do not like unnecessary ornamentation. I don't like ornamentation as just something you sprinkle on to the finished piece. A value system that I was taught and kind of attach myself to is there's the famous like shaker design quote, which is the quote that you should make nothing that is unnecessary, but if you're going to make something, you might as well make it beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, I love that.
Yeah, I that's kind of, in a nutshell, I think my relationship to ornamentation, where it's like, I don't think you should just like make the thing, and now it's complete, now go decorate it a bunch. But I think if you're going to make it, you should think about every component and try to make every component as beautiful as it can be.
Yeah, I mean, so I feel like I've seen that most applied to things like furniture or architecture, specifically within the shaker tradition, where it's like, here's a chair. It's got to have 4 legs. Maybe you could get by with 3, but then you're going to tip over like a Reliant Robin. So we're going to have 4 legs. It needs some extra pieces to be structurally sound, like some cross pieces. And then because you have those, make each one thoughtfully, carefully. Think about the shapes. Think about how it's beautiful. But then you're not going to add an extra spoke that's there just for decoration. Like every one of those pieces of the chair is functional.
Or most importantly to me, you're not going to get to the end and then paint it. You're not going to get to the end and then say, well, now let's just make it a color and
paint some birds on it.
Paint some birds on it. That is not my particular taste. That is not my value. I think I have a strong value for what I've described. I've actually spent a lot of time interrogating this, honestly, specifically when trying to articulate to my spouse my like values for decision making around what we do with our house, right? Which is an interesting thing. I mean,
there's a lot of continuity in my day.
Well, we don't disagree on things, generally speaking, but sometimes Hillary's like, well, why? And I have to kind of articulate more sort of precisely why I prefer one thing over another. And something I always come back to is what I've described to them as like authenticity. Like, I don't like things that are pretending to be something they're not. And that is maybe kind of, related to ornamentation a little bit, but it's not always. Like, for example, we've been planning a bathroom renovation for years and years, literally since before COVID, and it just is hard to find contractors and get stuff organized. But I think that a lot of modern bathtubs have is a sort of like hidden filler where like it fills through like a thing around the drain, or the filler like fills out of the thing. It looks like it's the overflow drain. Now actually it's like a secret filler.
The spout that fills the tub.
No. Yeah, the spout is not, there's no spout. There's no visible spout.
Right,
it's like an invisible thing that you just like, you turn the knob somewhere and then the tub fills up with water from one of these sort of other secret areas. And that to me is like an inauthentic design decision. It's like, why are we hiding the spout? What's wrong with the spout? It's like you're trying too hard to like elevate it in some way, or I think you think you're elevating it, but to me you're just making it silly and preposterous. And so I like when things are authentic in their design and not trying to hide what they are. Another example of this is like
doorknobs on cars.
Well, certainly the stupid door handle on the car, trying to like, hide itself.
Every stupid car now, it's like, where? I mean, this is a classic joke about graphic designers that like everything is hidden and looks perfectly smooth and quote unquote elegant until you reach for it and then the knob appears. It's like, what? Put the knob there so I know where to grab the thing.
Yeah, for sure. I don't generally think about cars much anymore, but when I was a kid, I was really into cars because I was a boy growing up in the suburbs, and it was fun to be into cars. And when it comes to like cars that I now would say that I like, that fit my taste, my subjective aesthetic values, it would be ones that are not covered in like aerodynamic cowls that are like, designed just to, shape air moving across them and to like conceal all of the mechanics so that it ends up looking like, a Power Ranger's knee or whatever, just like it looks like a computer mouse, right, when it's all said and done. It would be, a car that you can see some of the mechanics going on beneath it. You can even see, I think some of these like open-wheeled, like, kit cars are very cool where you just can kind of see the whole chassis and the whole everything. Like, seeing how things work is also something I like, and that's tied to the authenticity. The other thing I think that I can relate back to authenticity is again, in the sort of material choice, I don't love things that were designed, top down. think classic modernism, right? Like, now we don't have to make chairs in the way you describe, where we take wood and we, arrange it into 4 legs and a like frame that's sturdy enough to hold a person, and then we attach a seat to it. But instead, we're going to design a chair by like just drawing whatever shape we want on a piece of paper, and then we're going to get it manufactured however, right? We're going to have it 3D printed. We're going to have it, just bend this metal to our will, and then we're going to cover the metal in leather and, just make whatever kind of shapes we want. I really like when the materiality is part of the finished form and has sort of informed the finished form of whatever it is you're dealing with, right? That to me is another form of authenticity, where it's like, yes, you can make a chair any shape you want these days because we have technology to kind of do whatever we want with materials, but I think it is more beautiful to have used a material in a way that you are letting it inform the process and inform the finished design of the thing you're working on.
Yeah, I mean, that goes beyond just constraints inspiring a need for a solution. The classic constraints breed creativity, but it's like the constraints provide a space in which to interact with something and solve problems that can create beautiful objects.
It's also like, I mean, it is beautiful to have done something remarkable with wood, to me, more so than it is beautiful to have designed a shape and 3D printed it, no matter how beautiful that shape might be.
For sure.
And I think ultimately, like, then the piece can tell the story of how it was made in some way, where you can kind of see what this used to be. It used to be a tree, and now it is here, and how might it have gotten from where it was to where it is now, and what sort of hands or interventions might have touched it to make that possible. That's, I think, also a part of my aesthetic value.
Do we commit to the design of everyday things being the next book club book?
I thought we were going to do Why Fish Don't Exist.
I think we should definitely do the design of everyday things at some point soon, though, because so much of what you're saying is like, oh yeah, I like vaguely remember all these concepts from that book, which I really appreciated.
I mean, I happen to have a copy of A Pattern Language, which you have my copy on loan. I bought this.
You bought a second copy.
I bought this for a friend. I bought this book for a number of people, and I bought this for a friend, and I have to give it to them. But this book has informed a lot of my aesthetic values, I would say, or at least when I read it, I was like, oh, you just formalized a thing that like I knew to be true, but couldn't have like formalized and written down and articulated in such a clear way. And there's like 625 patterns in here, and many of them, not a majority, but maybe like a quarter of them are like, oh yeah, that is a thing I would say is also a value of mine. That's like very specific, right? Like this book describes why filtered light is a nice thing, right?
Oh yeah.
It's a thing you don't think about, like, but it is. It's so much nicer to sit, under a tree that has like dappled light than it is to sit in the bright sun or just in the shade completely. And this goes into great length to describe those very mundane things, like why they are actually beautiful, practical, functional, and there's a lot of things in that book that I think are also kind of touching my aesthetic taste or my values.
Yeah, so I'm curious how that both translates to, if you think it does apply to, I mean, honestly, games at all, just because on one level, like, games are kind of frivolous by definition, so it's like, does that go grind against your desire to focus on what's purely functional? And then, like, inside of the game as well, I feel like there's probably tons of details that relates to.
Yeah, you asked me the sort of highest level question, and so you got the highest level answer. If I was to like kind of refine things a little more, when it comes to like visual art, things made in the 2D plane that, can be looked at and appreciated with your eyeballs, and that's the way you're meant to engage with them. I, again, really like materiality. Like, I think there is a like palpable difference between a painting that someone has done with paint on a canvas versus in Procreate on their iPad, right? And all of the sort of technology that has gone in to try and make the iPad resemble a real-life painting as much as possible, it doesn't work for me. Like, I can tell so clearly. And that's actually one of the things that I feel like I bristle at with so much new magic art is, sometimes I'll try and convince myself, oh, this one just has, like, poor lighting or poor composition or poor sense of perspective or the sort of volumes are all wrong. But ultimately, if you look back at old magic art, there's plenty of old magic art that I really like that has all those things wrong or, kind of off a little bit. But when they were wrong and off, and it was a physical piece of art that someone made with their hands, it has a degree of authenticity to it that I do think is a value of mine. And it would inform what types of magic art I would like over others. And there's also something about, I think magic art has probably been authentic in the way I just described authenticity for probably its entire life. I mean, save for the digital paintings that are trying to mimic physical paintings. It's mostly been authentic, and I like the authentic story that the early magic art is telling more than the authentic story that the modern magic art is telling. Which is to say that, like, in the early days of magic, Like the first, like Alpha, they were just like, go buy paintings at, art market or like a, flea market or whatever, or get our friends that we know that we can draw or paint to like make little drawings or paintings. Like it was a really sort of ramshackle, just cobble this together to get it out the door kind of situation. And you can tell, like the aesthetic sensibility is all over the place for the cards in Alpha. There is a through line, but the through line is not the sort of meticulously crafted, creative directed through line that you see in a modern Magic set, where the modern Magic art is reflective of the fact that Magic is currently $1 billion, company that is the entire, really, it's the golden goose of Hasbro, which is a multi-billion-dollar company, and it's one of the only profitable sections of the entire organization. And as such, it is a very sort of carefully manicured product, and it is consistent in ways that are different than it used to be consistent, in the days of Alpha or whatever.
Yeah, and so much of that old art, it just, you look at it and it makes you ask a question. You're like, what is going on in here? Like, who is this guy and what's his backstory? And so much of the current art is just like, the only reaction they're trying to get you to have is, I understand the reference, and there's nothing deeper than that. It's like, great, you put instant ramen on a card, and it just really, really pushes me away.
Yeah, I happen to have the Scryfall page pulled up for every card that mentions Saproling in the Oracle text, sorted by release date ascending, with reprints turned off. And just like the original Thallid art, or Thallid Devourer, or Sporogenesis, like, they're just very weird. And, I think some people might listen to us say this and say it's just nostalgia, right? It's just, you like it because you knew it when you were a kid. It's literally not.
I did not play this game when I was a kid.
For you, it literally can't be nostalgia. For me, it could theoretically be, but I maintain there is a, like, clear aesthetic difference that I think is somewhat informed by some of the values I just mentioned, right? Of like authenticity and being able to like see where something came from. And I do think that modern Magic art is kind of like the facsimile of a painting more than an actual painting. And these are all paintings or drawings or whatever. That's what early Magic art was.
Yeah, it's almost funny though to me that in some ways is kind of counter to what you were saying before, where some of the new art I think is highly functional. It's like, we need this card to be able to communicate that it is a large creature with flying, so it's got wings and it looks scary, and that like is extremely functional in some sense. But I totally agree that there's something different that happens when a person sits down and tries to make something very functional very carefully that is so much more than if you literally could just optimize to the most functional version of a thing.
Yeah, I feel like this is something that has haunted me throughout my entire life, is that you pay too much attention to something, you really like focus on it and care about it, and it just like, it burns up in that bright light, and all of a sudden is not interesting or beautiful anymore. It happens to so many things that just get too popular, and then all of a sudden everyone's like walking on eggshells a little bit, or, trying to recapture the like prior success or whatever, and so often good things cannot be grown sustainably, and so they end up getting sort of warped into a strange version of themselves that is profoundly depressing to me.
Yeah, I think you put this really well on, I forget which episode, but a previous episode of the show, where you're talking about how once something has stakes, it's so much more difficult to have that, like, playfulness and, yeah, I think playfulness is a good way to put it.
Well, they're being playful, Anthony. They're being playful with instant ramen, just maybe not in the best way,
okay.
So, that's the thing, it's really hard to articulate what's different, but I feel it so pointedly. Yeah, there's something there. Okay,
but I don't want this just to be about bashing the current state of Magic. I want this to be about us talking about what we're enthusiastic about the game, which I'm going to do by bashing Magic a little bit more. But I had this really, really distinct realization a couple years ago when I was trying to figure out something about a friend of ours, Daniel, who has been on the show a couple times and has the all gold Reading Rainbow cube.
We're all always trying to figure out Daniel.
He has such an incredibly consistent taste and aesthetic when it comes to Magic. He loves legendary creatures and he has
gold cards.
He has many Commander decks that are all about legends. He loves Commander the format. He built a cube that has tons and tons of legends. And I was just struggling to think about, like, why does Daniel love legends so much? Like, it's just such a bizarre mechanic. Like, you can't have two of a thing. Who's excited about that as a mechanic? And I realized that it wasn't about that mechanic at all. Like, the thing that drew him to legendary creatures, I think, tell me if you think I'm wrong, but is the fact that he loves characters. He loves heroes. He loves the person that is driving the narrative and the story. And that is not at all my taste. At all. And I see that I feel like I have, and again, maybe you can offer some perspective on this because you and I have known each other for a long time. I have a really specific and strong sense of aesthetics, which is all about systems and particles and the way little things interact with each other and feedback loops. And I'm literally just thinking about the art that I have on my walls at home. And like, none of it is figurative. It's not about a story. It's not about a person that's in charge and is carrying the narrative forward. It's about a diagram of a river meander and thinking about the way that the river evolves over time slowly and through these little continuous interactions and feedback loops. Or what else do I even have on my walls? Like
silicon wafer.
A silicon wafer. It's all about, just these like crazy way that this extremely complicated system comes together into a functioning computer, and the narrative of the many people, the many hands that had to work on doing this research to understand how do we turn sand into a machine that can do math is the kind of thing that I'm really compelled to. And I see that kind of aesthetic connection both in like the art that I'm interested in as well as the art that I did. I was actually just bringing up some of the old work that I was doing in college for unrelated reasons the other day. And all of it is just like, I learned computer programming because I was just fascinated with systems and the way that you could set up an interaction between some very simple math, simple algorithms, like here's a circle, and then let's draw a second circle, and then draw another circle, and then have them interact in some way. And if we make small changes to the parameters, to the way that those circles interact, the texture of the way that system evolves can be totally different and really beautiful. Would you say that's fair to say? Like, do you see that kind of connection following through?
I think all of that is fair to say. I totally agree that Daniel likes heroes, and Daniel likes the proper nounness of those characters more than like,
that's a good way to put it.
More than like, here's a random knight or here's a random dragon or whatever. Daniel is always about stories, right? Like, that's Daniel's whole shtick. So I think you're totally right about Daniel. I think you're also totally right about yourself. And you do, I think, more so than I have, I think, a very refined and clear aesthetic taste in, again, all things, right? Like, from your, like, own art you make to the sort of things you want to hang on your wall to the sort of things you think about or want to read books about. Like, I don't think you particularly like reading books about, the hero's journey or whatever, or like some classic, tale of some person saving some other person or rescuing the kingdom or whatever. I don't think that's what you're interested in. You're interested in this sort of more abstract systems layer of thinking.
And I think that it's important to clarify that, like, one of those modes of thinking is not necessarily correct or better than the other. It's just a different perspective. But to speak to that specifically, like, the way that I was taught history in school was, it is this sequence of men, and yes, mostly just men, fighting wars and doing things on specific dates. And it's like
signing the Magna Carta.
Exactly. It's like all about, it was history through proper nouns. I love that way of thinking about it. And that just like never really worked for me. I was like, this is boring. I'm not getting anything out of it. I don't really understand it or care about it. And then more recently as an adult, I've been learning more about history, but through books like COD, which is all about the history of this one resource. And it's like, oh, as soon as we put it through this lens of a resource and think about how have many people interacted with this resource and exploited this resource and ultimately exploited this resource to its basically extinction, it's like, that is a narrative that I can understand because it's all about motivations and forces and these complex feedback loops, which is so much just more rewarding for me to get my head around than a series of proper nouns and a series of events.
Yeah, I don't think it's that you can't understand history when it's told the other way, but it's certainly not interesting to you, and it doesn't sort of slot into...
Yeah, to me personally.
It doesn't fit with your brain pattern, your, like, the way that you like to sort of think about things, so you can't then connect it to other stuff you know and are passionate about.
Right.
It just is a fact you're supposed to memorize, where I think that way of understanding history would be much more clear for Daniel. Like, I think Daniel would, like, understand the French Revolution a lot more by thinking about, like, Napoleon than he would by thinking about the, forces acting on...
Thinking about tinned beef and how important that was to the war.
That's part of the reason why I recently recommended A People's History of the United States to you, because it's really neither of those things. It's certainly not a history of the United States through the perspectives of, like, the great men of history or whatever. Like, it actually kind of explicitly excludes by name almost anybody you would expect to be mentioned in the history of the United States. But it's also not a sort of removed, cold, like, resource history. Like, it is a history of the people of the United States, right? Like, that is sort of the people's history is like a folk history, right? The idea of, like, here is what historians would have told if they were, talking to the average person during this period of the United States history, right? Like, not looking at the most remarkable or noteworthy things happening, but what's going on normally amongst, like, everybody in the sort of in mass, on average, basically, is kind of how that history book is told. So that might be sort of an interesting perspective for you too. And it's a book that I also really
definitely
changed a lot of my perspectives on things, which is another reason why I recommend it to people all the time. Yeah, I mean, I think I share a lot of your taste for systems, and I think a lot of people come by it the opposite way. Like, you loved systems, therefore you taught yourself to program computers. I think a lot of the people that do enjoy systems and like thinking about them was because they were taught computer programming, and then that sort of opened the door to sort of systems thinking for them. I mean, I know I don't think I thought in systems really until I learned computer programming in middle school or whatever, and started learning some Visual Basic and some True Basic, and was like, oh, I can write little things and then reuse them over here, and like that was sort of revelatory for me. And I do think that the sort of most of what I share in sort of that value is just stuff I've learned from you, right? Like, I think it is a big part of my sort of aesthetic palette too, if I were to describe it to a random stranger. But I didn't think to explain it to you just now because you're like the systems thinker that has influenced me. I mean, we've been close friends for nearly 20 years. We've influenced each other in a lot of ways, I would certainly hope. I think that's one way I can definitely point to and be like, yeah, I think I see a fraction of the beauty you see in that because I can see it through your eyes, and I have learned from you over the years.
Mostly, I think it's that I got you to eat vegetables. I think that was a good influence.
Okay, to be fair, that was mostly Day. You did not do that much cooking freshman and sophomore year.
Okay, that's fair.
You kind of came to it later. It was Day that was like, I'm not going to buy food. That's preposterous.
That's crazy. Oh, man. Talk about a guy with a consistent aesthetic and approach to life.
Miserly.
Just to add sort of like one more point to that curve, I feel like I see that aesthetic come through the kind of cooking that I enjoy as well, where it's not necessarily about like, I mean, sometimes it is, but as much like, here's the big turkey that's on the table. It's much more about like, let's think about the systems of cooking and the way that the ingredients are going to interact with each other. And increasingly, as I've been getting into, as you mentioned, like pickling and fermentation, it's literally about, I'm thinking about all these little guys that are inside this jar and what they're doing, and how do I set up the conditions for these little guys to have the behavior that I want, even when I can't interact with them directly. And it's so exciting and so powerful. And also, at the end, you get delicious pickles.
Yeah, I think that one might be a little bit of, the law of the instrument there. Like,
what about noodles?
I'm not sure how much like
Saprolings.
A turkey is a legendary creature. And
it absolutely is. The turkey is the legendary creature of Thanksgiving. It actually is just a creature. The turkey, the dish, is the legendary creature of the deck that is the Thanksgiving dinner.
Yeah, but you'll also do like a bosom or whatever like that. That's the same sort of role, I think.
Yeah. But really, it's all about the little banchan. It's all about those little guys.
And ultimately, like, you're still making a bowl of ramen. The bowl of ramen ends up being a hero, even though it's consisting of many little sub-pieces.
Many little noodles. Look, work with me here. So I had this realization, and it's like, you know that I like the card Slimefoot because I love Saprolings, but I have to be honest with you, I also kind of hate Slimefoot. Like, this is just not really the card that I love, because what I love...
Slimefoot. All my homies hate Slimefoot.
The sort of aesthetic quality of the early Saprolings was in contrast to that sort of like heroic individual narrative. It was the story of lots of just little guys that come together and sort of create this larger whole from the system. And it's not just, here's my one legend, it's look at all my little tokens and all the little counters I'm putting on them. And I feel like there's an aesthetic parallel between the kinds of things that I'm interested in, or the way that I'm interested in art and history, and in the aesthetics of the actual gameplay. Again, like going back to Frank Lance's point, not just the aesthetic in terms of what's printed on the card, but in terms of the way that the mechanics of the game work.
So you just saying you don't like Slimefoot because he's the legendary
And he also just
Saproling.
looks kind of dumb. He just looks like a bunch of mushrooms that have been glued together, as opposed to, like you were saying, these early thalids, which just look crazy and like of their own thing. Like, they just look so much cooler than just...
Yeah, what about Verdaloth the Ancient? Do you like Verdaloth the Ancient?
He is a legendary guy. I have had a lot of fun casting him. Yeah, I like that one. That one gets a pass. So I don't know, does that resonate with you at all, this idea that
sure.
like an aesthetic trend? And that's where I'm curious as well. Like, I think you very much do have an aesthetic sort of sensibility that also translates to, talk about your neoclassical cube, to the physicality of the cards. I think it's very important to you that in the neoclassical cards, these cards are treated as cards, as objects to be shuffled and handled and touched.
Yeah, honestly, it's kind of, I didn't think about that, but everything I just said about authenticity of materiality, like, yes, the neoclassical cube is played unsleeved, and it is because we are playing a card game. We are not I don't want it to feel like you're playing with expensive, valuable collectibles, right? Which is often what it just feels like when you have your cube double-sleeved and it's foil or whatever. It just feels like you're touching some valuable thing, and that's not what I want it to feel like. I want it to feel like just pieces of paper. Also, like, the sort of storytelling components that come through in, like, the Hunter Ornithopters cube, where you get to, like, have these alter ornithopters, like, that, too, is, like, touching on this continuity between aesthetics and form and the sort of place that something came from.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's really compelling, and I think that when people sit down to draft that cube, that is a huge part of the experience, and it does just change kind of the mindset. People are not sitting down and being like, oh my god, this is so crazy, I get to draft power in this cube, which is something that, an experience that people enjoy when they get to draft a powered cube, but you are just sort of forcing people into this more casual mindset by having these unsleeved cards and putting people into a mindset to engage with them on that term of that sort of physicality and that lack of preciousness that I think is really, really valuable, and I think affects the entire experience that players have with it.
Yeah, I'm sure I've said this before, but nothing brings me more joy in that cube than when a player who's, like, new to Magic, maybe only plays Commander or, like, plays on Arena, like, plays a whole draft night with, like, Mishra's Workshop, and then has no
this card
idea.
Was pretty cool. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it
I've
has
never seen a
no
card like that
idea the
before.
sort of history it has, or that it's, like, especially valuable or whatever. They just start riffle shuffling their Mishra's Workshop all night and thinking, like, this was a cool build around, and it's like, yep, that's
Sure
exactly
was.
what I want you. That's the exact experience I want you to have. You know.
I mean, that just reminds me, just because since we've already brought up Daniel, the moment that he opened a channel in, what was that, Eternal Masters, and he was like, this card seems pretty good. I don't know why we don't see this card more. Seems like people should be playing this.
And then we told him it was banned, and then he ripped it up and screamed, channel trash can.
Great moments. Yeah, I mean, and that's a powerful narrative moment where he was the hero of that story. It was not about a collection of small interactions.
So, why Saprolings? I mean, I think I know the answer to this question. I'm just going to tee you up here. Why Saprolings instead of, like, I think a lot of what you just described would be what Mark Rosewater would say is, like, almost the identity of White. Like, White's whole identity is a bunch of little guys working together to, like, a greater end, and there's a lot of mechanics in White about token generation and rewarding going wide and making a lot of tokens. I feel like that does not resonate as much for you as the sort of Saproling thing does. Why is that?
I mean, I think it does. Like, thinking about the early Commander decks that I brewed up, a lot of them were green-white, making as many different tokens as possible. But I do think that in addition to the aesthetics of the actual gameplay, there is also a second layer of the aesthetics of the game and the illustrations and the language that's used and sort of the intersection with gardening and plants or, you know, creatures of the forest. That definitely resonates with me a lot. I mean, it's funny that I'm very much like an indoor kid, but I also just love nature so much. I just like to have it in small doses. I'm a forest kid, not necessarily a beach kid or a what are some other biomes.
You would enjoy lots of things at the beach. There's cool things to look at the beach.
Yeah, sure, as long as I'm turning over rocks and looking for
You just want to
cool
have your
shells
SPF 70, jumpsuit on and a big old hat and your magnifying glass to look at shells and stuff.
Yeah, get some binoculars, look at some birds.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've been kind of thinking about this a little bit in regards to my Sacred Geometry cube, because that is a cube where it's not stated in the cube description because I don't know how to articulate it, but there is a clear aesthetic tone, a clear aesthetic through line that is kind of about what I feel like should be the iconic creatures of Magic or the iconic vibe of Magic, right?
Yeah, that's actually a really good point more broadly, just about like what defines a cube, and I think so many people will gravitate to, I mean, less so, but it used to be very strict. It would be like, this is my cube, it's all about the best uncommons and commons. This is my cube, it's all about powered vintage. This is my cube, it's all about massive color restriction. And it's much harder to talk about than, this is my cube, it's all about my taste and what I think Magic should be about. And I think we should celebrate those. Like, more people talk about like, oh, this is just a cube that's about vibes, or it's just my favorite cards. And I think it's worth celebrating that it's a little bit more than that. It is actually your personal taste and your statement about the values that you have about the game.
Yeah, and it's also like trying to figure out why something feels off if it feels off, right? Like, for example, no vehicles in that cube. Vehicles don't fit in my head in terms of like what makes sense to me in Magic.
I also could not fit a vehicle in my head.
And obviously, like, even if you're
Maybe
talking
a
about
Hot Wheels.
Even if you're talking about Magic as like medieval fantasy, there were plenty of vehicles in medieval fantasy, right? Like there were wagons and carts and battle wagons or whatever, and there were battle wagons in the game that from pre-vehicles being a card type and like having mechanics associated with them.
That big tall one that then has the flop that goes down over the castle wall.
Yeah, that guy.
We
of
all know
course.
those.
So,
is the Trojan horse a vehicle?
I mean, not in Magic, but yeah, I would say yes abstractly.
Okay,
yeah.
Cool.
So it's not like I'm saying that, it's weird to have a dragster in Magic, because it is, but I also just like something else about the vehicle, the card type, the mechanics, it doesn't feel like it fits to me. Meanwhile, like equipment does. Like equipment feels like it totally fits, and that's a relatively modern thing in Magic, the idea of equipment as a card type. But it feels consistent to me. It feels more sort of coherent with the language that I'm trying to pursue in that cube. And people will recommend cards all the time where I'm just like, yeah, it just doesn't feel right. And I oftentimes can't point to exactly how or why, but it has to do with like the Magic I remember being excited about when I was a kid, or even when we got back into the game, right? Like when we got back into the game around Origins, I remember very excitedly discovering it wasn't Gatherer and Scryfall didn't exist yet. It was like
MagicCards.info?
Yeah, MagicCards.info is exactly what it was. And I remember like just poring over just like pages and pages and pages and pages of cards that had been released since I last looked at Magic cards, 15 years prior or 10 years prior or whatever. And I at no point was struck with like, oh, Magic's gone weird. Like, it's certainly not in a bad way. Like, I saw Eldrazi for the first time, and I was like, this feels kind of like a natural extension or extrapolation or, like, in the same language as, like, Phyrexians, like, this cool, like, weird, abstract monsters. Like, it all felt still very much of the same language for the most part. And I don't feel like that's true today. Like, if I discovered Magic today and started looking at the cards that have been released most recently, working backwards, I would be like, okay, things have gotten weird in Magic. And I'm trying to avoid anything that gives me the feeling of like, okay, things have gotten weird in the Sacred Geometry Cube specifically. I want it to feel, like a love letter to the core foundation of what Magic is, recognizing that all the ways that it's grown and all these sort of extensions of it are still Magic, obviously, but I want to sort of honor the sort of core of the game without being tied specifically to like a nostalgic period and like old border cards specifically.
Yeah, totally. And you mentioned the Phyrexians, and I think that's a really good example of how the aesthetics of Magic have changed in a way that it is just less for me. And I feel like that's an important thing to say, is it's like, yeah, we can get a little bit negative about how Magic has changed. They've really deliberately changed it in a way to make it more accessible to more people, and I recognize that I'm the weirdo here. I'm the outlier. The old Phyrexians were very much in this style that I thought was really, really interesting. It's like they were these faceless monsters, or not faceless, but soulless, without any spirit. They were just this force of...
kind of Borg-like.
Exactly Borg-like. They were about just consuming, and they are this force made of these many little particles of infected creatures that were slowly taking over. And it was this kind of like narrative of this faceless force versus the heroes, and I think that faceless force, even though it was the bad force, was something really intriguing and interesting to me, and they've very much restyled the Phyrexians into heroes, or villains, I should say, but like villains with proper nouns. Like, here is Elishnorn, and this new set about the Phyrexians is all about Elishnorn taking over and, having this epic battle with Elspeth. And that is so much less interesting to me than let's peer into this little world of this corrupting oil and the way that it's subtly influencing things. It's just a totally different aesthetic take, which I get that other people can latch onto the proper nouns so much more easily, but it's just really not as compelling to me.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like it can be both. Like, I like the Eldrazi Titans, for example, to go back to the like first Eldrazi set. And I think that they serve as kind of like the masthead, the figurehead of like this big force. And just to tie this back to our like, silly abstract aesthetics conversation, you would get excited if you were walking through the woods and found one really big, beautiful mushroom. Like... You wouldn't be like, boring, I want to see all the little mushrooms. Like, you would be excited if you saw one, like, incredible mushroom or, like, a big, giant, beautiful, like, notable tree. Like, you'd be excited by that. You wouldn't... It's not that you are only interested in the sort of small, dispersed systems. You can appreciate...
You're right. One big mushroom, I would lose my shit about.
You can appreciate a, like, notable thing.
But that's Mycoloth. That's the one big mushroom.
You like Verdant Force.
I do love Verdant Force. That's true.
So I don't know. I feel like these things are not completely... It's obviously not a binary, and they're not one thing or the other. And to me, at least, I do agree that... I think like the Phyrexians are a good example of just... I think it used to be kind of just like vaguely weird, evil stuff. And honestly, a lot of the influence of like the individual artists would come through. The voice of the artist drawing the Phyrexians came through. Phyrexians in like the early days did not look consistent. It was kind of like if Kev Walker's drawing them, they're going to look one way, and if quick name another old artist that drew Phyrexians,
Chippy. If
Chippy's drawing them, they're going to look another way, and that was just like fine in the sort of oeuvre of Magic. And now I feel like honestly, what causes a lot of the sort of soullessness that I feel in a lot of the modern Magic art is that you're not seeing the sort of hand of the artist as much. They're basically there to execute a consistent creative direction, a consistent creative vision, which is better.
Yeah, in a lot of ways it is better. It is better serving the goals of creating the product they want to create.
It's also like, from a practical standpoint, the Phyrexians probably should look similar, right? Like it works in that regard. It's just that because Magic is operating at a certain scale, they can't all look similar and also be the sort of creation of like an auteur of like one person's vision that has room for interpretation in the sort of little implementations of them. Like if they could have just said, Kev Walker or Chippy, you are doing every single Phyrexian illustration for all time. Here's like some vague creative direction, but we really like what you sort of naturally brought to this, then I think they would have been able to explore that and find new sort of corner cases and edges that would have been interesting and deep and had a lot of the things we still appreciate about it without maybe having the same soullessness. But that's just like, it's just like, to me, it's not even a thing to be like critical about or even to be like mourned. It's just that, like a giant corporate machine with a bunch of project managers managing a bunch of other teams of people that are all, responsible for collectively bringing this really big, complicated thing to life. That's not how you make soulful art. That's soulful art is never made that way, and it is ridiculous to expect that it would have been made that way, that they would have been able to scale up the sort of operation that was responsible for...
Yeah, I mean, so I think what you're saying is, like, celebrate the early days of Magic because it was a very unique time that could not last. Like, it was not a thing that could... It was not sustainable.
Right. I mean, like, if it was to last, then you and I probably wouldn't be playing Magic because they wouldn't be printing enough Magic cards for it to be the size game that it is today, and it probably wouldn't have reached us, right? Like...
Yeah, I mean, I'm just looking at old Saprolings, and I think if there's anything that is like similar to Slimefoot that I feel like is a little bit more resonant to me, it's Thelen of Havenwood, because he is a human, and I think that that's kind of this really elegant kind of narrative to me that here is the proper noun figure, and he's kind of an external force within this world of the mushrooms. Here's all the mushrooms growing, and then here's somebody coming to kind of curate and cultivate and exert some control, and that just feels like this very human narrative, or a narrative about humans that to me feels kind of mixed. It's like, yeah, he's here cultivating the mushrooms, that's cool, but also the mushrooms, shouldn't they just grow in their own natural way without the intervention of humans? And then Slimefoot, they're like, no, the cultivator must also be a mushroom, and it just looks kind of silly.
I would posit maybe, how much more would you like mechanically a card like Gave, Guru of Spores, if not for the fact that it has such a reputation for being, at least in the era we were playing a lot of Commander, like a groaner of a like weird combo commander. Like if it wasn't for all of the associations you have with that format that you don't love, mechanically, like this idea of this like big legendary fungus that like is able to manipulate this system in like different ways and like move things around in a very systematic way. Like Gave is not, a 2020. It's not this like huge creature that just wins the game on its own. It wins its game by like strumming the strings of the system,
Yeah. I mean, I'm into that. Just take away legendary so I can have 3 of them and they can all strum together.
There we go. Does the word Saproling not appear on Thelen of Havenwood?
Technically, no. He just cares about funguses and thalids.
I was going to say, because it's not in my search here. I mean, I know the card, but... Well, that's 46 minutes. What else you got?
I don't know. I was thinking about this idea of aesthetics, but I was also just thinking about some of the systems, broadly speaking, that I find really fascinating, and I'm wondering if it might be interesting to talk about those and then try and tie those back to Magic in some way.
Give it a shot.
So, I mean, I mentioned river meanders. I feel like that is something that is just such a powerful metaphor. So river meander, basically you have a river in a fairly flat valley. Instead of just running straight down the valley in a straight line, it'll wind back and forth. And the physics of it are crazy, and I don't really fully understand it, but it is a lot of sort of feedback loops, and the idea that as the water's moving faster, it'll deposit more of the sediment it's carrying. If it's moving, sorry, did I say that backwards? If it's moving slower, it'll deposit more. If it's moving faster, it'll pick things up. So if you have a slight bend in the river, it will be depositing more on the inside of the curve and picking up more on the outside of the curve, just because the river has to move at differential speeds, right? Like, imagine if you've ever had this interaction, like the wheels on a car. If you didn't allow the wheels on a car to turn at different speeds, you wouldn't be able to turn the car very quickly, because the outside wheel would be shuddering as it tries to, or one of the wheels would be shuddering as it's trying to move at the same speed as the other wheel while moving a different distance. Mm-hmm. There's also something about vortices that I don't really understand, but it's like these little feedback loops begin with or turn a small sort of variance in the course of the river into increasingly exaggerating it and causing the river to meander back and forth, and then extend that over longer periods of times, and eventually the meanders get so big they connect back to each other, and it sort of like snaps together, and you end up with oxbow lakes. And over time you end up with this floodplain that's just sort of scarred by all these past versions of the river, and I just think that is so incredibly cool. And it's also cool that it kind of maintains this equilibrium of the river always roughly looks like this shape. It always looks like a meandering river, but not in the details. The details are always sort of changing and evolving. There's sort of a dynamic equilibrium to it. How do you feel about river meanders?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely very beautiful. I'm sure I told you this, but related, a thing I learned recently that was fascinating to me was when I was growing up, the way I was taught about how canyons are formed, like the Grand Canyon, is like, oh, the river eroded away all this like canyon over time, right? And so, of course...
Is that not true?
Well, it is true, except if that was the case universally, then the Colorado River is not anywhere near as old as the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River doesn't cut through any gorgeous, vast canyons. And what I pictured when I was a kid and I was told this is like, all right, well, you have a big plateau and you have like a stream running across it, and then over time, the height of the water gets lower and lower and lower as it sort of cuts through this rock face. But then, like, yeah, why is that not true of every river on the planet? Why are there not big, beautiful canyons everywhere? And it's because what happened actually is that you probably know a lot about the fact that if you were to trace the elevation of water in a river from its source to the ocean, it follows a very predictable curve, basically, because water flowing at a certain speed is going to just erode things, and it's going to basically like try really hard to track this curve over time as it approaches sea level.
Sure, I mean, similar thing, like the faster it's moving, the more its ability to erode, and then as it approaches the sea, it's going to start depositing. So yeah, that makes sense that it will, again, through a similar feedback loop, kind of approach a similar curve.
So the river never, had this crazy line from the sea where it was like all high elevation and then it like over time eroded this thing. The river has basically been in the same place the entire time. What caused the Grand Canyon was a bunch of tectonic activity that pushed the plates up, that pushed the earth up while the water was basically cutting through it. Because if the water's already following that path to the ocean, then it's not exerting a lot of friction or, what's the word again for when water takes away the dirt? Erosion. It's not exerting a lot of erosive force on the land. It's just in that case, when the tectonic plates pushed all this rock up, the river now was, as soon as there was a little bump there, now the river was exerting a huge erosive force on it, and that over time is what cut the Grand Canyon, basically.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
And I wonder...
So anyway, what's it have to do with magic?
Do you think it's reasonable to sort of apply this idea of this sort of dynamic equilibrium where things are constantly in flux and always look different in the details but still follow a general structure to like a magic metagame? I think that the easiest way that I've ever sort of seen it broken down and easiest to think about is an article that Frank Karsten wrote about what if we played Modern with no ban list. And it's like, or sorry, not no ban list, no card limit.
Card limit, yeah.
And he sort of looked through the history of Magic and was like, okay, well, if you're allowed to play 40 or 60 copies of Chancellor of the Dross, you just win on turn 0 every time. And then it's like, okay, but then there's a strategy to be able to defeat that. And then there's a strategy to be able to defeat that. And so there isn't necessarily, even within this game that seems like there is like one mathematical correct solution to this game, turns out there's not. And there's this kind of like weird dynamic metagame that evolves from that system.
That is one of my favorite articles about Magic ever, and it's so impressive to me. I'm not sure how many people Frank talked to like try and figure out what the sort of most competitive decks would be, because I think most people would get to 60 copies of Chancellor of the Dross, which, by the way, just says if it's in your opening hand, you may reveal it. If you do, you drain your opponent for 3, or they lose 3 life. Therefore, you have 7 cards in your opening hand. They're all Chancellor of the Dross. Your opponent loses 21 life before a turn of Magic has taken place. I think almost anybody would get to that and think, well, surely that's it. Surely that's the best deck and there's no beating it. But turns out, no. There's actually a deck there's a Ripple Burn spell, and I think the deck is like, a third Lotus Petals and 2/3 Ripple Burn spell or something similar to that. It's a third like instant speed mana. Or maybe it's not Lotus Petal because you can't cast that. It's the Pitch Monkey.
Oh, Simian Spirit Guide.
Simian Spirit Guide. It's just Simian Spirit Guides and a Triple Burn spell, and that allows you to kill your opponent in response to them trying to kill you with Chancellor of the Dross triggers. But then again, there's ways to beat that deck. It's such a beautiful article, and I don't know how it quite relates to the river meandering, but I do love it.
That's okay. Not everything has to be connected.
Sometimes podcasts are just a series of things you say.
Yeah. I also wonder if there's sort of, again, this sort of connection of this evolving but sort of stable equilibrium with power creep in the way that they managed and like deliberately designed Magic for many, many years, where they would, rather than, like, power creep is a thing that they knew about as designers of Magic and wanted to avoid. They wanted like all the cards to be reasonably compatible over time. So
and honestly, they mostly are. It's kind of amazing.
Yeah, you can still play Giant Spider.
Yeah, I mean, I counted. I'm trying to include as many copies of cards from Alpha as possible in the Sacred Geometry Cube because I think it's cool. And I think it's like 13 or 14, and some of them are the best cards in the cube, and some of them are like reasonable playables. Like, for all that, lots of people have complained about power creep over time, it's amazing that you can still play with cards from Alpha and cards from the latest set, and it all just works.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that there was around, 2020, like a pretty deliberate change that they made, but that's not as important. And I think that era where Standard really was the format that they were designing for primarily was just super cool, and their strategy was largely just to power creep selectively and then combine those power creeps with powering down things. So they'd say, like, okay, well, for a couple years, let's increase the power of removal spells while we're decreasing the power of creatures, and then let's power up red burn spells while we're decreasing the power of something else. So it always felt like there was something new, there was something fresh, there was something that was still more exciting, and the fact that Standard was a rotating format meant that they could do that very deliberately and keep having something coming up without overall the system moving in a specific direction.
That does in some ways feel to me like the golden age of Magic, when they had sorted through some of the growing pains, let's call them, of like having a big popular game and not really knowing how to like do R&D properly and just accidentally printing incredibly broken cards. And they kind of figured out that like limited was the thing they were going to support, and like how to design for limited, which wasn't a thought given to the first few Magic sets. Limited is something I do think about, because I actually do think that modern limited is probably about the best limited has ever been. I know that at least when I stopped playing retail limited because I started focusing on cube all the time, it felt like sets were just getting better and better. And I hear people talk about it all the time, that like almost every modern limited set is like as good as the best limited set anyone remembers from prior 2015 or something. And I wonder if like it's possible to have that coexist in the world where the thing they're primarily designing for is Standard, and they do have this sort of rotating power creep, this sort of cycling, because I think part of what makes a lot of modern limited sets good, and this is purely speculation because I do not play limited anymore, is it seems like they kind of have a formula that works, and they kind of stick to it more or less for limited, like a certain sort of distribution in commons and uncommons of certain types of effects. They just kind of have cracked it a little bit in terms of like just how to make an interesting baseline metagame, but that makes them a little more sort of samey, I think, from set to set, compared to like, just thinking about Invasion block limited is like completely and radically different from the block that came before and after it in like huge ways, because they were still like, oh, limited. I mean, we're going to try some stuff. Who knows? And I feel like nowadays they kind of have it more nailed down. Yeah,
that's interesting to sort of think about these different eras of Magic and having different strengths to them. Like the early Magic was very strong in terms of having diverse art styles that created some like really, really incredible pieces, I think, but having some failures in terms of like consistency of card design. And then that era where Standard was really the focus, and that rotating system was really powerful and created a very compelling and consistent way to engage with the game. And then this current era of having solved many of the problems to make limited formats that just work. And it's like in each of these phases, there are different strengths to the game. So it's interesting how much it has changed over time.
Yeah.
Okay, can we talk a little bit about fractals?
Of course.
Just because we're talking about sort of like the aesthetics of systems and the aesthetics of like little things coming together. Fractals have always been this thing kind of like stuck in the back of my brain that I just find them so beautiful. And when I say fractals, I'm talking about like, you could picture your classic Mandelbrot set, but also like L system fractals where you can kind of math it out on paper or imagine in your head, like you draw a line and then draw a Y off that line, like 2 lines extending off of it, and then take those same angles and add those to each of the previous 2 lines. So you have 4 lines, and then repeat that process continuously, and you end up with this sort of fern pattern.
If you get just 10 friends to sign up for this thing, and they get 10 friends to sign up, you'll be rich soon.
Fractals are not meant to be used that way. Fractals are for good. Don't do that.
It is a little funny to me that we're talking about these like broad aesthetic values and like everything you've described about systems. You should love pyramid schemes.
No, I like ferns. They're different. Ferns are not pyramid schemes. So there's another aspect of fractals, which is we have these like beautiful fern-like patterns that we can imagine. We also have like the defining quality of fractals is that you see repetition across different scales. So it's different than just tiling of like imagine bathroom tiles where you just have the same sequence repeated. Instead, you have the same sequence repeated at different scales. So taking your Mandelbrot set, you have this big sort of like funny snowman shape. But then if you zoom into little tendrils in this sort of like complex texture around it, you end up seeing that same snowman shape repeated at different scales, in different distortions, in different patterns. And I find that just aesthetically incredibly beautiful. But I also think it ties back to game design in a really important way. And the sort of thing that kind of made this connection to me was playing a lot of Minecraft when that was sort of new, when we were kind of like experiencing Minecraft as it was being created. And at some point they introduced this concept of biomes of, well, there's not just, oak trees everywhere and it's very consistent. It's now there's an area that has oak trees and grass, and there's an area that has sand and dunes and cactuses, and an area that's more jungle. And the first sort of iteration of that was it was like a level up in terms of adding more novelty and interest to your experience, because you'd walk into a new space that had a very different resources and different texture, different aesthetics to it. But it was also then very sort of, it had this second level of consistency where every biome was like a little bit the same size, and you'd get used to, if I walk for 3 minutes, I'll hit the next biome, and there was this next level of consistency. Do you remember this kind of phase of the Minecraft development?
Yeah, honestly, I feel like it's still kind of there. Like, I have never been satisfied with the options. When you create a world, you can choose like normal biomes or big biomes, and I'm like, I want both. Why is there not different size biomes?
I think I think they did at some point introduce more of that, like, and describing it as like fractal biomes, where it's like you'll get some that are very big and some that are very small, and that extra layer of novelty meant not only are you just entering a new biome, but the experience of how big is this biome going to be creates this second derivative of uniqueness and novelty in the game that I think is really, really compelling. And I agree with you. I think it could maybe be more extreme, although it's been a long time since I've played Minecraft.
Played a little bit last year, and I just didn't, explore enough to feel that, but yeah, what a great game. I'll say this, fractals don't do it for me. For all the sort of like, for all the things that like we share in sort of in terms of aesthetic.
How did I get fractal brained? When did that happen?
Before I met you, because when you arrived freshman year of college, you were already making weird fractals.
I think it might have been the book called Chaos in Fractals that was on the bookshelf in my childhood bedroom.
Oh, did you accidentally sleep with it under your pillow a couple times? That explains everything.
I think you just have to flip through Chaos in Fractals a few times at a very young age.
Did a spider bite the book Chaos in Fractals and then bite you or something?
Oh yeah, have I never shown you my huge Mandelbrot scar from where a Mandelbrot spider bit me? And I think that also really applies to, in addition to Minecraft, I feel like this informs a lot of my thinking about cube design, where there's one thing about having the 5 colors of magic and the 10 color pairs, but there is a level of uniformity that happens if you then try and just treat each of those the same, like these very uniform Minecraft biomes. So as I'm approaching cube design, I'm very often trying to think about how do we have some things that are bigger in scale and some things that are smaller, so you have little pockets of novelty to explore, and drafting one color pair isn't going to be the same as drafting another, just shifted over in terms of what are the mechanics, but is going to take a different approach in terms of maybe I'm splashing differently into different colors, or this archetype, this color pair is more about finding cross synergies between some bigger synergies, whereas one of them is much louder and more focused on just something that is very clear.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because I could feel the comments coming when I was saying that modern limited sets kind of have a sameness to them. Because I know there's obviously a lot of variation. Someone could probably send me links to a bunch of 17 Lands pages about the difference in sets. And sure, whatever. But the sort of uniform adoption of the uncommon signpost gold cards is a great example of the kind of sameness I'm talking about, where it's like, that's a great idea, right? And it's such a great idea that they've decided to basically do it in every single set because it just kind of works. But that speaks to that sort of sameness you're describing now of like, what if every biome was the same size? It's like, yeah, every color pair they're trying to make viable. And it's like, that makes some sense in the sense that like, you feel kind of bad, I guess, to be the drafter that wanders into the, metaphorical draft biome that happens to be super small. And you're like, oops, I guess my deck is bad. And if you're trying to like optimize for people having a great first experience drafting the set, so they put more bits into Arena and buy more coins to then do more drafts, you would not want that to happen. But I think there is something about the novelty of like feeling like you're exploring a like new format and discovering like, oh yeah, actually these 3 color pairs are wildly unplayable. And like that's kind of, and this would never work obviously in the era of 17 Lands either, but like that's kind of interesting to me in the old school days of limited, where it was like, yeah, like whole things were just terrible or so deep that the whole table was doing them, and that provided a lot of variety from set to set and made it feel more like it was sort of figuring out what was good rather than figuring out how to play each of the probably 6 to 10 very viable decks that exist in almost every modern format these days.
Although I think that that sort of idea extends beyond just the idea of like imbalanced power level. Like to give a concrete example, in regular Cube, Black-White is usually kind of like an Aristocrats themed deck, but every once in a while you get a few zombie payoffs, and it's like, okay, well now my deck has a little bit of a zombie tilt to it, and I'm thinking about things in a little bit of a different way. And I think about that very much from this idea of the fractal perspective of how do I make that little synergistic set of cards just exist on a different scale than some of the other synergistic themes.
Yeah, for sure. That's a whole hour. It's an hour and 5, all about Saprolings and Magic. We'll see how much I cut out. It's an hour. Probably. I don't think I'm going to cut 5 minutes out of that. That would be crazy.
We could talk more about fractals if you want.
Do you have more things in your notes?
No. We'll save these.
Save it for a future. Here's the thing. Here's what I'll say. Maybe the first bonus episode is all about your mold exploration.
I'm really excited about this whole... I've just gone deep.
We've gotten so many comments.
3 pickles on Wednesday, and they're looking great. I'm eating pickles faster than I can make them.
That one dietitian wrote in to say that you're totally good.
Thank you.
You're Gucci on the eating pickles all the time.
Eating kimchi every day.
Yeah, I think we got so many comments, people that wanted more mold talk, and it probably doesn't belong in the main feed.
Maybe it does.
It could be.
I just have to figure out how to grow Koji on Magic cards. That's the next step.
Ugh. It's going to be a lot of... You have to do a lot of sanitization of those Magic cards. There's going to be a lot of competing spores and little guys.
Multifaceted project. We're going to need to call up Nile Red and figure out how to turn a Magic card into sugar first or something.
Yeah. Bones and Kate are going to be so excited that I get to use the little guys stinger in this episode.
Little guys.
They're obsessed with it.
I don't even remember where that started. Which episode did that start?
Okay, look, I have to go figure out what episode it started in because I have to go get the stinger again. But sometimes my intros are really good and I work really hard on them. Sometimes I work very not hard on them and they're pretty good. Sometimes I work very not hard on them and they're pretty bad. And this was an episode where I couldn't think of a good intro. I tried some things, couldn't think of anything good. And we talked a lot about, we said the phrase little guys a lot in the episode. I can't remember why. And I went on YouTube and I literally just typed in little guys in YouTube and found this completely strange video with like no views, not a popular video, doesn't make any sense. Some dumb joke that somebody made, but it has this voiceover where this guy goes, little guys.
Little guys.
And he's like reading this like fake, it's a robot voice reading this like fake news story, but it mentions specifically like Bartlesby or Bartlesburg, Oklahoma, and they're like, we've been there, we know where that is, and they love the little guy stinger, so.
Little guys.
Little guys.
Little guys.
On that bombshell, that's the end of this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you for tuning in. We do not yet have a bonus feed that I just kind of half alluded to, but we've been talking about it, so stay tuned for that, potentially. All the music for this show is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This podcast is produced by Thinking Really Hard About Magic Cards and speaking into microphones about it. Anthony, thank you for the gift of friendship and for the gift of Cube.
Thank you for letting me talk about my favorite topic in Magic the Gathering.
I love
Saprolings.
I love talking with you about systems. Thank you for influencing my brain so much over the past 2 decades.
Thank you for influencing my brain. It's mutual. I wonder if next time, sometime in the future, I wonder if we can talk about systems and playgroups. Do you think there's anything there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's going to be... At some point,
you're struggling there.
At some point, I had asked people to maybe send in some voice memos for playgroup, advice they wanted for the idea of a call-in show to get relationship advice, but it's about your playgroup or whatever. And we got not that many, and most people didn't actually send in voice memos, which makes it so much harder to produce a nice, fun episode about it. So the other thing I thought, though, when people sent that in, is it'd be very tricky for you and I on this very public forum to talk about the sort of really detailed ins and outs of playgroups, because people are going to be listening and be like, well, they're just talking about...
That's Bob over there,
they're just
for
talking
sure.
about dirt. That's clearly about dirt. You're sometimes you have a member of your playgroup who's really charming, really fun, everyone loves him, but he also loves making 9/11 jokes, and that makes some people uncomfortable.
Sometimes you have some of those
just
guys.
Some people are like that, and
Well, you pulled off that Band-Aid real quick, so I guess we're fine to do this episode if people will send in more voice memos.